People are so critical in building a successful business, which is obvious. Human brains, your worst trauma and your purest joy, every human feels the exact same way.
Luke Schoenfelder, who began his career on Apple's retail floors, never imagined that less than a decade later, he'd be partnering with Apple again. This time as the CEO of Latch.
One of the things that I realized that we kind of had as a mantra at Latch was always take the flight. Oftentimes there's just no substitute for just showing up, and if you really want something to happen, just willing it into existence. There were a lot of different opportunities that we had in the sharing economy, in the smart home, and I think like solving sometimes smaller problems, but doing it really, really well. And I think those are things that you go back and you think about.
Luke Schoenfelder, welcome to Change Order.
Jason Shuman.
We are at the offices of a job that you helped get me.
Well, yes, I guess that's true. We're a lot larger offices than when I first met Primary and first met you many years ago.
Many years ago. Let's talk about that first meeting. I think there was some viral stuff on Twitter about VC associates.
Yes.
Why do you think we didn't get along in our first meeting?
That's a fantastic question. Look, I think that, so to synthesize that argument for the audience who maybe didn't see the Twitter argument, it was about whether or not it's worth spending time with associates at venture capital firms. And there was a very strong cohort, I think, on both sides. And I would say that when you and I first met, I was absolutely in crush mode, trying to raise this seed round. And you were working at the time for Corrigan Ventures, which is now Alpaca. And they were going to be a very small, like, follow-on check to a round that Primary was actually leading, and Third Prime. And so I think when we got connected, I'm kind of like, who is this punk asking me like these like really intense diligence questions to participate in an oversubscribed round and put in $250,000? And so I think I remember exactly where I was standing. It actually wasn't an in-person meeting. It was a phone call. So I was down at Brookfield Place and had just stepped out of like another lunch to talk to you. And I thought it was going to be like a procedural, here's the data room. And you're like, well, in year 3, your cohort data, whatever. And I'm just like, who is this guy, right? And at this point, we're pre-revenue. And so whatever, Jason was asking great questions. But it was a moment where I think I wasn't in the mindset of getting really tough questions, particularly from associates. Ryan, who is the founder of Alpaca, had actually called me on a Sunday, your then boss, to beg to get into the round. And I'm like, wait, you're begging to get into the round, and then I get this like super intense diligence call a few days later. And I think that was just the headspace that I was in. So fast forward, and Jason ended up being really user number 1 for the Latch products and testing it at his building, which was owned by Corrigan. And the Corrigan team did an amazing job in supporting us. Shout out to them. And then, we've built a decade plus friendship now.
Kind of like brings up this question though, when a company is a high flyer and you need to give a shot, right, to like an associate, how should associates be approaching those conversations with great founders? Like, should we not ask the hard questions? You
should absolutely ask the hard questions. I absolutely respect super hard questions from analysts and associates. I think it's all about the tone, right? And I'm not saying you had the wrong tone, but we were meeting with some summer interns actually at another venture firm yesterday, just kind of socially, and they had really cool thoughts and really good suggestions. I think it's all about the way in which they approach it. And I think for me, when I'm interacting with someone who I know is a subject matter expert in an area that I don't know, I typically am like, hey, you're the expert here. I'll literally say it out loud because it disarms people and be like, but I was thinking about this. What do you think about this? And if that framing happens, it can kind of allow people to have their guard down where they're like, okay, I'm the world's expert on this, but this person has a cool idea. And then you can engage with it intellectually as opposed to it being an attack. And I think that particularly if you're a high-flying founder that's in fundraising mode, you have kind of a lot of people telling you everything is amazing. And so then when you hit someone who's like giving you friction, you're like, wait, but I'm awesome. Why are you presenting this friction, junior little kid? And I think that is the thing that happens where if you can couch the question in something that is like not deferential, but acknowledges that this founder is probably the world's expert in whatever weird thing they're trying to do, I think that really helps diffuse the situation.
It's funny you say that because when I think back to that first meeting, and then there was another meeting at the Techstars offices back then.
Yes.
And I remember feeling like, okay, this guy rubs me the wrong way a little bit.
What?
But there's something about him. And now at this point in my career, when I meet with founders and they rub me the wrong way a little bit, it's kind of a signal in my brain that like, maybe I should dig deeper into like why, because maybe it's something within me that I'm identifying that maybe
what do you think it was? What do you think it was with me?
I think it was two things. One, I do think it was what you're saying, which is that, you know, we were a smaller check, you were closing out the round. The other thing is, I actually think you and I are more similar than we've ever really talked about.
Yeah, I think that's probably true.
You, I think, have talked a lot about, you grew up in Lancaster.
Yep.
You were going out. Lancaster.
Yes.
Sorry about that. You know, there's not a lot of media out there in Amish country. But I feel like you were going out on the farm early. You were working super hard. You know, my dad, when I was growing up, he would go to the office like 5 a.m. And I learned a lot of work ethic things from him. And we both had a lot of like childhood challenges at the end of the day. And I think we both kind of felt a little bit of something to prove to the world at that point 100%. In our careers.
Yeah. And I think Josh Wolf, he said, you know, chips on shoulders, put chips in pockets. And I think that's totally true. And I think that there's a lot of young people who show up in New York City in their 20s and are like, I'm going to make this city mine. And I think it's a really amazing energy that you have when you show up here from all over the world, all over the country. And you're like, this is my shot. Like, if I can make it here, I can make it anywhere. And I think you and I both were, I mean, sub 2 years in the city for sure.
I was 2 months.
2 months. Yeah. Okay. I was here starting a lot in, I guess, 14. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it is just that youthful desire to push yourself and see what the world around you, how it's going to push back.
I mean, speaking of your childhood, I'm curious, like, what do you feel like you learned from growing up where you did?
Well, obviously everything. No, but I mean, kind of and one of the companies that I've been working very closely with and got to help start is called Autobiographer. And it's really about helping people discover, preserve, and tell their life story. And so in building the product, I've spent a lot of time talking to our biographer, our AI biographer, and, you know, and it's something everybody should do because you go back and you realize these moments that shaped you are so different than what you might put in a resume. You discover things, the little details of your life that end up having all of the impact on you in the future. And I think, you know, as you mentioned, I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania, had my first paying job at probably age 6 or 7 years old.
What was that?
I was responsible to get up and feed the cows in the morning. And so I'd get paid, I want to say it was $1.50 a day to go out around 6 o'clock in the morning, 6:30 in the morning, and shovel grain and silage.
I have herded cows before.
You have?
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Yeah,
with Kelvin Beecham down in Texas.
No way. I was just talking about Kelvin yesterday, actually. But if you see one of the silos, those are filled with silage, and silage is whatever is left off of a corn plant that is not the corn itself. They cut into small little pieces. Think of it like a chopped kale salad.
Yeah.
But they pickle it to preserve it. So you have a giant thing of, I don't know, like fermented corn stalks. And I think that teaches you, a lot of responsibility. If we didn't get up and go out there, you know, rain, sleet, or shine, and make sure that they had something to eat. And I think that sort of responsibility and providing for another living thing was something that taught me a lot. I also was homeschooled growing up, which my wife endlessly makes fun of me for. But that was another thing that I think brings about independent thinking, because you do spend so much time in your own mind and with your own agency. And I think the way that homeschoolers or people who've been more independently educated see the world is just different. And that was something that I used to be not embarrassed about, but it made me weird. And now I'm like, oh, that was awesome, right? And, you know, I also had a dad. So I was homeschooled, and then my dad was a public school teacher. So this is in the 90s. And so at this point in time, Apple computer had always been really big. My dad was a huge Apple computer fanatic. We had a Mac in my house since I was born. That was this moment where the internet was just arriving. The iMac, or the Internet Mac, was now this new appliance that was sitting in everyone's home. And I remember getting the first digital camera that we could get our hands on to borrow, and it took 10 photos of probably a sub-megapixel image quality, I think, each. But all of those little things I was learning kind of at the frontiers of consumer technology. At the same time, I was growing up in a farmhouse that was built in the 1700s on a farm feeding cows in the morning. And you're like, this is a very weird existence, but you can only make sense of how weird it was when you start to compare, oh, like, what was your childhood like? And I think that I'm now increasingly grateful for those things that I got to experience as I was growing up, and just realizing nothing's kind of an accident. They've all been like super formative in why I'm interested in the things that I am, why I've pursued the things that I have.
So you're saving a lot of money on your therapy bills by talking to your AI autobiographer.
Look, I think that therapy is amazing. I think that there are elements where it's about exploring, right? And I think that there's a lot of things in our lives that all of us have things that we've worked through, but there's a lot that has shaped us that isn't traumatic, but it just is. And when you start to click in as to why you perceive the world in the way that you do and what your inherent biases are, it's been really fascinating.
It's interesting because when I use autobiographer now and I'm sitting in my apartment, I'm like, oh, maybe I'll just do this for 10, 15 minutes. And then I find myself an hour and a half later being like, oh my God, where did my day go?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, don't ask themselves like the hard questions about their life or other people, and they're not constantly thinking about those things.
Yeah.
Or B, other people aren't asking them.
Yeah.
So when you start getting asked it, it's just like you're rolling out.
100%. And have you had any memories that you had forgotten come back to you?
Oh, so many.
You're like, whoa, that was back there? I totally forgot about that.
Yeah, and then it's amazing because, and for context for other people, Autobiographer is a company that you started recently.
Yes.
Maybe you want to give a little bit about that.
Totally, yeah. So Autobiographer, I'm very fortunate to be one of the co-founders alongside Matt Bowman, James Barnes, and Ivan Almiral. I'm the chairman, so have gotten to be very involved in helping shape the product strategy and the marketing. I'm not day-to-day, but it's been an awesome journey with those guys. And basically, our vision was, how do we help people better understand their life story and preserve their life story for themselves, but also the people around them? And so when you think about your grandparents, your parents, there are so many things that are in their life that when they're gone, either because they pass away or because they don't remember them anymore, you will not have access to anymore. And I think as we learn more about genetic memory and some of these other things, intergenerational trauma, intergenerational memory within our genetic code is a thing.
Oh, yeah.
And so, we talk a lot about biological, inherited traits, but there's actually psychological inherited traits that actually permeate our biology. And so I think that understanding why we are the way that we are, and being able to have a lens that is a little bit more objective, a little bit more patient, to help reflect back to you the stories that shaped you, and also have an optimism around it. I think that, part of the thing that we've really tried to do is have this very curious, very warm, very friendly, literal voice, and also sort of narrative voice that is pushing you to be kind to yourself, and maybe encouraging you to show up as a 10% better version of yourself. And I think that as Autobiographer continues to evolve, it's this really amazing tool for understanding yourself for yourself, but helping other people understand you too. So it's been really awesome to get to work on that product, as particularly in the last couple of years of just sort of reflection as, I'm gearing up to do the next big thing now. It's been awesome to have this time to sort of prepare and think about what has gotten me to this point.
There's a fascinating study out of Mount Sinai. I don't know if you've ever heard about this,
know.
There's one of the doctors up there who looked at genetic sequencing from the basically newer generations of Holocaust survivors.
Yes.
And they did MDMA therapy, and it ended up impacting the actual genetic sequence and improving, their stress and anxiety response.
Was that the NYU study? It was NYU and Mount
Sinai?
Yeah,
I think it was. There's a doctor that works between the two, I believe.
Okay, because I've heard about that, and actually the therapist that I work with, we've talked a lot about that. She studied at NYU, and she works a lot with Holocaust survivors, because people were trying to understand for years why these things show up like in later generations. And it's because it's genetically encoded. And when you have a traumatic experience like that, it shows up. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that and understand that, and to see that there's not just, not that psychology isn't scientific, but there's actually like a biological scientific answer to why intergenerational trauma is a thing. It's fascinating.
I mean, my mom's a therapist, so I'm always interested.
Oh, actually, I forgot that. I did know that, but it was not registering right now.
I think the psychology behind founders is like as fascinating to me as like the business strategy. And, you mentioned traumatic events. I mean, your father passed away when I think you were 14.
Yeah.
Like, what impact did that end up having on you, and how do you think it made you a better founder and who you are today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. I wish my dad was here. In so many large and small ways. But I also know that I would be a different person had that not happened to me. And I say different, I'm not saying better or worse, but just different. I was already a pretty self-motivated, independent agent in the world because of the things that we brought about. But at 14, basically being on my own in a lot of ways, and being responsible in a lot of ways to help my younger brother grow up and understand, what that next phase of life was going to be like for him. I just took on a lot of responsibility super, super young. And I think as other people were enjoying their late teens, early 20s, I was like, okay, I have to figure out who I am going to be in the world to provide for myself and provide the physical and financial safety that I need to live my life. And I think that was a huge motivator for me to go and say, okay, what's the hardest game to play? What's the hardest game that I can win? And like go at it. I think that one of the things that is obvious, but is really important to acknowledge, is that the mental toughness is far, like, generally the biggest distinguisher, more so than physical toughness. And I think that as we've talked a lot about mental toughness, I was with another gentleman last night, and what he was sharing is that he believes, and I've said this for years, but it was cool to see him sort of validate this, that human brains, your worst trauma and your purest joy, every human feels the exact same way. But it's a calibration exercise. So if you have lost a parent as a child, getting a rejection from a college or having your high school sweetheart break up with you, it's like, here, it's a 7 because you've already had a 10. If you haven't had a 10 in terms of like something really bad happening, not getting into the college you want, you may feel as the most intense loss, trauma you've ever felt. And I think that for me, having that calibration very early on, saying, okay, this isn't the death of my father, this isn't the having to figure it out and provide for myself as a teenager, this isn't that, okay, I can calibrate, I can survive this, was a huge source of strength. And I think that for founders, folks that have had, and I do not wish trauma on anyone, but I think that folks that have survived some very intense experience will probably outperform founders who have not, because they've just calibrated themselves a different way. And what I'll say is that I do believe that that calibration can happen later in life. Maybe it is not getting into the college you want, really processing that and saying, this was an intense trauma. Life is going to have a lot of intense things that happen. This was one of the worst that I experienced. There's probably going to be one that's worse. I hope there's not. But like, let me dig into my feelings and really understand that and understand what this is doing in my brain. And I think the people who can interrogate those moments and integrate those moments are in a far better position as founders, because I don't know who said it, but they say an entrepreneur only knows 2 emotions, pure elation and pure terror. And I think that that is pretty reflective. And you kind of just bounce between these poles. But when you've had crazy highs and crazy lows, the goal is, how do I take that calibration that I have and sort of smooth out the curves so that I'm not constantly ping-ponging between this is the worst day of my life, this is the best day of my life, this is the worst day, this is the best day, because that is exhausting. It's exhausting on our nervous system. So it's how do you take that input and say, oh, I'm still good, I'm still cruising, I'm still cruising, I'm still cruising. And I think that's what the best founders are able to do, and compound that over, you know, many years, a decade that it takes to generally build a really large and scaled business.
In many ways, I think about it like pain tolerance. You know, and then the more pain that you ended up experiencing, the less, you know, you can feel the pain when it's coming.
Yes.
And it feels like as a founder...
Or the less that you still feel it, but the less that it slows you down.
Thus it slows you down.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Because if at the end of the day, you are used to, you know, or you've seen what a 10 feels like.
Yes.
And you're now playing between a, you know, 3 and a 7 pretty much on a daily basis.
Yes,
it feels like it's much easier to go through because you're not hitting that upper bound every single day.
100%. And that is what I think is what enables founders to sustainably improve and sustainably perform, is getting that 3 to 7 and not getting to a 1 or a 10.
And staying like smooth throughout, because it's very easy for people when crisis hits to react and freak out and make a bad decision.
Yes.
Whereas I think if you've gone through the highs and you've gone through the lows, then it's easier for you to run through that smoothly with a very clear eye and a clear strategy.
100%.
So I just want to ask one other question related to your dad. You said he was a public school teacher. I totally forgot that.
Yeah.
Why did he decide to homeschool you?
So it's funny. You think, okay, that those are contradictory, but both of my parents really believed in the value of education, and in the formative years where someone is setting the value system that they have for the world, the intellectual interest and curiosity that they have for the world. And, you know, my dad and my mom believed that for my brother and I, being homeschooled would give us the best opportunity at that, and that was the way that they could best provide that capability and that experience to their kids. But then realizing that many kids would not have that opportunity because their parents were not able to make that decision. And we were super poor. My parents very much chose that because they said this is the highest value, is the way that our, you know, children are brought up. And, you know, I think that was, and going to intergenerational trauma, my dad lost both of his parents by the age of 16. He lost his dad when he was 6 and his mom when he was 16. And my mom lost her father when she was 6 years old. And I think in my dad's case, he said so many other kids have incredibly difficult situations at home. If I can create an environment where for 8 hours a day, they have that stability and they have someone rooting for them, telling them that this is the way that the world can be, that's the greatest impact that I can have.
So one of the things that I believe in, I mean, you didn't grow up in an area surrounded by a bunch of founders and entrepreneurs.
I did not, no.
And one of the things I believe is in exposure.
Yes.
You ended up starting your first company young as well. You ended up working on a company down in Haiti.
Yeah.
What was that pivotal moment in your life where you got exposure to something that led to you starting a company?
So kind of two answers. So one, I weirdly had a lot of my family who was involved with the space program. So my uncle, my dad's only brother, works for a company called ILC Dover that has made the spacesuit since the Gemini program. And so my uncle was a quality engineer for the spacesuit, for the Mars Pathfinder mission, and was incredible for my brother and I because he's this incredibly humble guy, but was literally working on the spacesuit and was taking us to the office and bringing us. I remember he let me take a prototype Apollo 1 helmet and a glove that had actually been on the space shuttle to my kindergarten show and tell class, like for class. And I remember the time being annoyed that my mom had to be there because I'm like, wait, why can't I just like rock in with this like space helmet, you know? But I think it was his interest combined with my dad's in science and technology that said, hey, like people you know build the craziest stuff. So like that's a path that's open to you. What I didn't know was the entrepreneurship path because I did not have any examples of people who were founders. So I had people, there were examples of people that either loved or worked with advanced technologies in my kind of immediate or extended family. But I think the first time where I saw, oh, I can do this was I read a book about a new type of construction technology that was actually inspired by NASA when they were trying to figure out how to build a base on the moon in the 1970s. And so when I read this book, I'm like, well, you take polypropylene bags, which are, if you've ever bought rice in bulk, maybe you're in the pandemic, those like sort of plastic woven bags, that's generally polypropylene. And so if you take those bags, you can actually connect them in a way that is very structurally sound and will create homes that can last for thousands of years if they're plastered and coated the right way. And they cost basically nothing because it's plastic bags. You fill them with dirt. You use different metal kind of barbs effectively to brace them. And you can build houses very inexpensively. And so I was reading about this in a book. And I'm like, well, maybe I can just build one of these in my backyard for fun. And so, you know, I give huge kudos to my mom. She said, all right, well, we'll let you build one in the backyard. But if it doesn't work, you have to clean it up. And I was like, all right, that's a deal I can get down with. And so the summer of my freshman year of college, I was able to get a group of my friends to help me kind of nights and weekends to build this house. And it's the construction technology is called earth bag, to build this earth bag structure. And I had no idea kind of why I was doing it other than to just prove that I could, and ultimately built it. And, you know, was in the local paper talking about how I felt like this could help with housing in the developing world. And, you know, fast forward 6 months, 9 months, and the Haitian earthquake happens. And all of a sudden, you have a need for really strong, really inexpensive housing. And I got on a call with someone who was running an organization down in Haiti after the earthquake. And I was thinking about spending the summer of my junior year, now I was at Georgetown, in Haiti, maybe building with this technology. And we were talking in January, and he basically said, well, you have a spring break, don't you? Like, why aren't you coming down and doing this on your spring break? Why would you wait till the summer? And that kind of dare, I'm like, all right, yeah, why am I waiting till spring break? Or why am I waiting till the summer? Let's do this on spring break. Inspired me to call my friend Ben, another lifelong friend who also worked with me at Latch, to build earth bag structures in Haiti after the earthquake. And I got my passport for the first time to get on an international flight to go to Haiti with the plans for this thing on an iPad and like $300 in cash.
Oh my gosh.
And I think that's kind of and I didn't realize how insane that is until I'm saying it now. I'm like, okay, I had 3 pairs of clothes, an iPad, and $300, and I'm going to like build a new type of construction technology. And at that time, one of the most unstable, dangerous places in the world with UN peacekeepers in the street. And I think that was one of those other experiences that only a crazy person would do that. But then when we'd have a rough day at the office at Latch, I'm like, well, at least I'm going to go back and sleep somewhere that has like electricity tonight. At least I'm going to go back and sleep in a bed because, you know, we spent a lot of time in very rough conditions. And, you know, I think it built a lot of resiliency.
How did that first call come about with that person? I mean, you didn't have your passport. You probably didn't know that many people.
No. A friend's older brother kind of heard about what I was doing and that I was just kind of interested in doing this independent project and was very interested in housing. And he's like, hey, I just met this guy. This guy, Spud Marshall, is at Penn State. He was back, I think, for Christmas break. So I connected with him. And he really took an interest in me and was like, all right, you're really trying to make moves. I just met this guy in Haiti. I know that housing is one of the priorities for them because they have to rebuild so many houses right now. Why don't you just get on a phone call with him? So I got on a phone call, and Sam, who now works with World Central Kitchen with Jose Andres, he basically just dared me to do it. And I, got on the plane. And, one of the things that I realized that we kind of had as a mantra at Latch was always take the flight. Because there were so many times where it would have been so much easier just be like, oh, they probably got this. It's probably going to be fine. But oftentimes there's just no substitute for just showing up. And if you really want something to happen, just willing it into existence. And the spaces all over the world that I've decided to just like will it into existence. You know, you were there for a lot of the journey as we were making some of our first hardware products. We had to make, I mean, I've lost track of how many times I've had to fly to China. But from New York City to Hong Kong, it's 14 and a half hours on a good day. And the number of times that would just be like, a meeting went bad 1 week and you're just like, well, I guess I'm going to China next week. And I think that kind of ethos and attitude was something that I was very grateful to have gotten to experience early and have great mentors to just say, you have to go and do it. You just have to go and do it. And Thomas, who you've obviously met, you know, my co-founder at Latch, was someone who, even though he was an industrial designer, you know, at the highest levels at Apple and IDEO and lots of places, he was willing to go to the factory and talk to the person who was doing the thing, because he knew that the end result was going to be the sum of all of the energy, all of the life force, all of the decisions of the collective system of people and ideas that would come together. And to just do one part of it and just be like, hope it works out, is not a viable strategy. When you are trying to do something that's never been done before, you have to see it the entire way through.
I think it's reflective of two things I've seen from some of the most successful people. And like I've personally felt it a lot, which is one, somebody gave you a shot or took an interest and a liking to you early on, which you clearly got that. And the second is like having a sense of urgency no matter what. And that's what really getting on the flight is. And I think a lot of people don't get on the flight anymore, especially since this pandemic and Zoom world. And it hurts relationships, and I think it hurts outcomes in more ways than people realize.
It totally does.
Do you see that playing out more and more, especially as you were a CEO during the pandemic as well? And like, were you trying to manage that before?
Trying to manage
the whole, like, how do you drive urgency and getting people to do things in person?
Yeah, I mean, the urgency thing, it is the difference between good companies and great companies. You have to have that urgency in everything that you do. And I think that sometimes people are like, well, why are we doing this so fast? And it's like, we're doing this so fast because the world is changing so quickly that our assumptions are likely to be valid for only a short window of time before the world changes. So we have to get this thing executed before the world changes around us. And if you wait too long, the world has moved on. And particularly with hardware, anything that you're looking at conceptually is, generally speaking, 2 to 3 years from whiteboard to being installed somewhere or being, you know, in someone's hand. And so if you're seeing a set of assumptions about the world, you have to predict where the world is going to be in 2 or 3 years. That is insanely difficult. And so it is like, well, let's move as fast as we can to be in sync with where the world is.
And so you were working on these homes in Haiti.
Yeah.
And I'm curious because the world has been talking a lot about modular housing ever since then. And that was what? That was like
modular
15,
housing.
16 years ago. Do you have a point of view on the future of modular housing now?
Yes, I do. I think that I've split it into 2 categories. So if you have sort of single home units, so the ADU, the backyard home, etc., there needs to be an appliance version of the backyard home for it to work and effectively offer no customization. It's like, this is what it is. The minute you start to touch any level of customization, you're done. Like, you cannot manage the SKUs. You cannot manage the complexity. It does not work from a, we're going to manufacture this in a factory and ship it. How many different SKUs did Tesla offer in the beginning? Almost, you know, I think you could change the interior color and the exterior color.
It's like the Model T.
Yeah, totally. Very few options, right?
Yeah.
And I think that nobody has built a compelling enough product that you can just drop in the backyard and say, you can choose any color as long as it's black. This is the thing. There's an opportunity there. I still believe in that. Anything that deviates from that is not going to work. And I also would say the same thing around sort of modular housing in the multifamily space. A bunch of people have tried being like, oh, we're going to just build apartment buildings in factories. I don't believe in that at all. I think that you need so many site-specific materials, site-specific issues. I mean, we dealt with so many building code things that you would never think about at Latch for one component. The idea that you're going to sit in a conference room somewhere and plan out a modular unit that's going to comply with every building code it everywhere in just the United States alone, it's impossible.
It's not going to work.
I think where on the multifamily side, things can be very interesting is if you take that same appliance mindset and do an appliance kitchen where it's the entire kitchen, an appliance bathroom where it's an entire bathroom, because these are areas of a space that don't change that much. Like everyone kind of knows how they would like to use a bathroom. Everyone kind of knows how they would like to use a kitchen. And yes, if you're building your dream home from scratch, the island might be bigger. You might have a warming drawer for Thanksgiving to keep your rolls in. You know, there's little bells and whistles, but the bread and butter of how someone is going to live in an apartment with a kitchen, with a bathroom, are not going to change. And I think that those elements are the best places to start in modularization. And so I think companies that are focused there and can keep the SKUs to a minimum have a real shot. But I haven't seen anyone really doing that. And I think it's SKU minimization is the name of the game.
It's super challenging because, I mean, as you know, selling into real estate owners and developers, very difficult, right?
Very difficult.
And I think that's why you've seen more companies pop up on the modular side that are selling direct to consumer.
Yes.
Whereas,
but nobody successfully.
Well, I mean, you think about why. It's not a business model that has high gross margins. Nope. There's very low repeat at the end of the day, if any at all.
Yes.
And so now you're stuck with a CapEx intensive business model with low gross margins, no repeat, and probably very challenging financing environment.
All of that is true. And the person who gets that modular home is still going to look at it and be like, oh, I really want to change the wood grain on the cabinets, because no one is having on the design side enough like force of vision to say like, you don't get to touch the cabinets, right? Like this is what it is. This is the thing. And so I think that that is the opportunity, is for someone to be bold enough to say, and I don't know if this is the right idea, but everything is stainless steel. Everything. Like, you can't touch it. This is just what it is. It's stainless steel. You can hang tapestries. You can put up whatever you want, but the entire thing is made of stainless steel.
So before you started Latch, you worked at Apple. You're talking a lot about design and having a very opinionated approach to design.
Yes.
I do wonder, what did you learn from Steve Jobs and his approach to building a company?
So I never met Steve Jobs, so I don't want to. So anything I've learned from Steve Jobs is from books, and but I will say we had a lot of people on the team that worked directly with him on my team at Latch, and I think the things that really stuck out to me in working with people like Thomas, people like David Austin, who's absolutely amazing, who was the first product manager for Keynote when Keynote was just a Steve Jobs product. So if you use Keynote on your Mac, that was initially an internal tool that then now is used by millions of people, tens of millions of people around the world. But in working with people that had worked with Steve, I think that the thing that I took away the most was the need to focus on the entire thing, the entire way through. There was no like handoff where it was just, oh, okay, it's done now. It's like, no, it's done when it's like in the box, in a customer's hand, being used. That's when it's done. And I think so often when you're a CEO or you're developing a product, you're there in the product requirements phase and in the business requirements phase, and then maybe in the technical requirements phase, depending how technical a founder you are. And then, something just pops out the other side and you're like, ta-da, it's done. And it's like, that is not how great products are built. It is built in all of the little decisions along the way. I remember when we were designing the lens, which is the black circular module that is like the brain for all of our lock products, we were working on this very unique way of effectively simulating a touchscreen, but doing it with a backlit stencil and a bunch of different LEDs. And we had to make the whole thing appear dead front, meaning look like a black screen, but when it lit up, feel like it was a screen. And so I remember being in so many closets, literally with Thomas, with cables running into the closet to look at the way that the light would come out of the stencil or how it bled around the edge. And those little details were never on the whiteboard, because you're not like, well, what's the light bleed around the edge of the insulation layer going to be? You just never can predict these things. And you have to be committed to caring about the light leaks, because you realize that the way that someone perceives the product, 5 years later, 10 years later, is going to be all a result of all of those tiny little decisions that you made along the way.
When you ended up starting Latch, you guys were in development for what, 3 years before you went to market? Maybe more?
Three and a half. Yeah.
It felt like 5, I'm sure, to both of us.
Oh my God, yes.
How do you keep a team motivated during that period of time?
You basically have to just predict the future and just say, look, this is what the weather report 3.5 years is from now, and we just have to stay focused on it. And I think where we got very fortunate was that, you know, market timing is just so critical. And we made a bet in 2013 that the on-demand economy, the sharing economy, was just going to continue to explode. And it's like, well, obviously. But to take us back, I mean, this was a time when Uber was a new thing. 2013, Uber's new, Airbnb's new, Instacart is new, DoorDash doesn't exist, I don't think. Amazon doesn't sell groceries. They don't own Whole Foods. They don't sell groceries online, right? And we said, all of those things are going to exist, and we're building a product system for when the consumer problem is, I want to order things and have them delivered to my building when I'm away, because my primary mode of ordering things is online. And in one way you could say, oh, that's very obvious. But at the time, in 2013, there were not these services available. And so what happened for us is we were able to say, team, this is what we're building for. This is the world that we're building for. And then every time DoorDash launched, Amazon bought Whole Foods, Walmart bought Jet, another primary portfolio company, we were able to signal, see, like, this is exactly what we said was going to happen. When Amazon Key was announced, which was enabling unattended deliveries, you know, all of those things were just validators for the macro world that we had predicted. And so I think it gave investors and employees a lot of confidence of saying, okay, the team no one has a crystal ball, but they seem pretty good at forecasting the trends here about where the consumer economy is going and then how that's going to intersect the B2B real estate world.
So did you find yourself standing in front of the company every month at an all hands, like continuing to repeat that narrative?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think somebody can keep me honest, but I mean, we had weekly all hands for a long time. We did daily stand-up for up until we were about 25 employees, where literally everybody stood in a circle in the morning and said what they were working on that day and what they were blocked by. And I think it was because that urgency is so critical that it's like, no, this can't wait till next week. Like, if you have a problem, like, sort it out now, right? And I think that sense of urgency is what makes, as we spoke about before, is what really separates the best companies from everybody else.
Totally agree. I mean, I think sense of urgency and like learning.
Yes.
How fast can you learn? Because the amount of shots you can get on net at the end of the day will ultimately decide if you're successful or not.
100%.
It is very hard, though, in a hardware company because you're spending multiple years developing a product. I mean, there's the famous story about the Segway, right?
Yes.
He was developing that thing for a long period of time, probably didn't talk to a lot of customers, all of a sudden launched after raising hundreds of millions, and poof.
But he was right. And that's where timing comes into play. What he had predicted was micro mobility a decade before it was relevant. I mean, if you look at Bird and you look at City Bike, that was the Segway thesis, just with a more conventional vehicle. And so I think that is where I look at, do you know Jeff Stefanis? Great buddy of mine. He started a company called Ride, which was one of the first electric bike companies in the United States. And he had the same thesis. I mean, we were talking about it. We lived together when I was starting Latch. He was starting that in 2013. This is five years before Bird, any of these things. And he had a micromobility thesis. And I think it's that, you know, market timing in so many of these cases is what is the difference maker.
Speaking of market timing, when we ended up investing in Latch, that was 2015.
Who's the we?
I say the royal we because Primary did, Corrigan did. It was the royal we.
You've been on the cap table with a couple different hats.
I've been on the cap table with a couple different hats, and somehow, you know, didn't end up on the other side of that personally, you know, making money. But I look back at the market timing, and I remember writing the investment memo. And that memo, when you read public market reports or analysts, probably some 24-year-old at Goldman, the market size was $300 million. It was tiny.
Yeah.
You were still able to go out and raise $26 million plus before you had a lock installed and like real revenue.
Before we had a lot, like meaningful revenue, yeah. You had a lock installed.
I had a lock installed. I was lock number 1 or 2. Yes. But How are you able to raise so much money pre-launch in a market that people defined as being sub 500 million?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people realized that we were helping create the new category of PropTech. That was not a term that I had heard when we started. And I don't know when you think that term was invented.
Probably right around then.
Right? And
Yeah.
so we were helping create the PropTech category, and we were also helping create the smart access category, neither of which existed. And so I think that our goal was saying, yes, locks have existed for thousands of years. Yes, access control badges have existed for 30 years. I mean, you can only trust research reports so far, but I'm sure they're saying it's a $20 billion market now, right? And it's like, well, there's no way it was a $300 million market 10 years ago and it's a $20 billion market today. One or both of those things is wrong. And I think it really goes to show that if you have a product that really works and it's going to be something that impacts someone's daily life in a major way, you can use that singular touch point if you have the right business model to build category defining businesses. And I think, again, Josh at Lux, what he told us when he wrote the Series A check alongside Zach Schildhorn was that we at Lux believe that if you can get one building working end to end, that every other building will follow. And it was not, an MVP of this one thing, It was like, no, get an entire building working, because what you're doing at Latch is creating a new way of cities working around, digital identity. And, I think that encouragement to say, focus on the highest level thing that you're doing. We're not building a lock. We're building this entire system and this entire ecosystem, really gave us the freedom to focus on the things that matter and to create the smart access category and help create the PropTech category.
That is so meta and high level and like grand, like you're taking people to the moon with that vision.
Well, but it was honestly, I think such a simple thing, because then at the end of the day, you had to go back and just make sure that the Bluetooth unlock speed worked, because if it took too long, you'd just be like, why am I not just using my key? And I think you
definitely know that one.
Yeah. And I think for you, I'm sure there was a moment where, maybe the first 6 months even, it was like, why am I not just using my key? This is annoying. But then there was a flip that happened. We were like, oh yeah, this is way better. Oh yeah, this is way better. And I think it was as we continued to sort of fix all of the consumer touch points and make it faster and faster and faster and faster and better and better and better, then it got to the point where it's like, oh yeah, this is way better than using my keys.
I will never forget. I don't know if I've ever told you this story. So Latch was one of the first ever investments I ended up making in my venture career. And as you know, we were like door 1 or 2.
Yep.
And the battery kept dying.
Yes.
And you would show up, Brian Jones would show up, Ryan, like a bunch of early employees. They would literally come over in the middle of the night, the middle of the weekend, and they would come and like fix the battery. But it happened so often at the beginning that I remember getting inside my apartment one day, maybe 6 months into my venture career, and one of my roommates looks at me and he goes, man, I don't know if you're good at this whole venture capital thing.
Dude.
Like, this is a brutal experience.
It's a lot.
And then I'm sitting there and I'm like, man, the lock keeps breaking. And I had like a decision I could make. Do I want to keep it to myself and believe in Luke and the team to fix this? Or do I actually want to go into the office and be like, David, Ryan, like,
I'm worried
I don't
about
know
this.
what's going on. Maybe you guys need to step in here. And I kind of just like was like, you know what? I believe in Luke blindly. I think you'll figure it out. And it was amazing to see the progress though.
Well, and I think that was really, we decided to do the whole thing, not do some iterative version that didn't have a camera, didn't have a touchpad. Like, it was like, no, we're going to do the whole thing. The battery's only going to last a week, but we're going to do the whole thing. And then the battery lasted a month, and then the battery lasted 6 months, and then the battery lasted a year. And then at that point, we had done it, but we were picking the variables that we were going to bite off, one by one. And now, now the product is used more than 100 million times a year, and it's all off of your beta testing.
One of the things I think that's a superpower of yours is storytelling, and you're mentioning the big vision here. If a founder comes to you and asks for advice in pitching VCs and telling a story, what do you typically give them?
I mean, I think the most important thing is to pick a problem that matters to the world and matters to you, if you can find, there's lots of problems in the world and there's lots of problems that matter to you. If you can find one where there's overlap and it matters to the world in a big way and it matters to you in a big way, then you're not storytelling, you're just talking authentically about something that's interesting to you. And I think that this is where, you know, I think some founders make the mistake of being overly scientific about, okay, I like the pet care industry. I like the D2C model in the pet care industry. And it's not to say that you cannot build amazing businesses there, and you guys have done that. You've backed companies in that way. But I think that generally the most breakout companies are based on people following some larger passion problem that they have in their daily life, and then realizing that that problem is one that resonates in the broader world. And I think that when I look at founders, particularly founders that have never started a company before, or maybe are at the early stages of being like, could I start a company? My advice to them is always think about problems. Anytime you get that like, ugh, this is frustrating in the course of a day, write it down. So it's like, and a lot of times those problems are not ones that you can solve. But what's funny is that, you know, you think about the little things in your day that are frustrating. Oh, my coffee is more expensive than it should be, right? Like, why am I paying so much for this coffee? And, you know, you look at companies like Blank Street saying, okay, there's a way to unbundle this in a different way. And that was a space that I don't think many people would have said, oh, coffee needs to be like reinvented. This is a problem space where we don't have solutions. But they're like, well, it doesn't need to be reinvented, but it needs to be more efficient, and that there's a consumer now who is more price conscious, cares about brand, cares about quality. How can we give them something that's in a different way that is a little bit more unbundled than, you know, what others are offering them? And I think that's an example of a more pedestrian business problem that someone saw and really changed. But I think that founders, when they're in the early stages of trying to find an idea, it's looking in their daily life for things that are annoying to them. And if you don't have something in your daily life, go pick a weird industry and just start asking people what's annoying, right? Like, go talk to, you know, I remember designing the latch system for elevators was so complicated, so much more complicated than I ever thought. And it came to the point where every time I got into an elevator, and there was an elevator technician, which happens a lot because elevators break down. Yeah. I would just start asking them like, oh, yo, like, what are you working on today? What's going on? And like, people will just tell you things because very few people are asking the elevator engineer what is frustrating in their day to day. And that doesn't mean that elevators are going to be the next big business thing, but you never know those little insights that you might find if you just start asking the questions. And so I think for me, I've always been curious, but I love finding what's annoying to other people, because then you start to see you gain insights about something in a particular industry, or you learn about something that may be happening in one industry that's applicable in another one.
I think though what you're talking about is ideation.
Yeah.
Whereas the thing that I believe you're exceptionally good at is how do you articulate that vision out to the masses? And it feels like to me, if I were to play back a lot of what you just said, you do a very good job of painting the picture of the world that you believe will happen in the future.
Yes.
And then articulating how the world has changed or how it will be changing in the future. And you're customer obsessed.
Yes.
So you're thinking about these are the needs of the human being and what they want, or the customer in, you know, a business setting.
Yeah.
And then bringing the investor into that world with you and like along for that journey. Is that a good way of summarizing?
That's exactly right. Yeah, it is. And it's a more distinct way. I think the other thing too is people, investors want to be a part of something. Like, you don't wake up in your day and say, oh, I'm just going to like buy some stock today. You're there because you believe, and you want to believe in people, a mission, in doing something different in the world. And I think the more that you can bring people along for that journey to be a part of it is also a superpower. And I think a lot of people, you know, particularly first-time founders, they're like, I want to keep my board, I want to keep my investors at arm's length. And yes, there are moments where you're like, hey, look, I got this. Like, stay out of my stuff. But the reality is that if you can be on the same team as your investors and really make it, you know, part of solving the problem. I remember talking to Brad when we had a failed UL10C fire test, and I'm in Northbrook, Illinois. It's the middle of the summer, and we had raised whatever 15, 60 million bucks. We're waiting to get this approval so we could go to market, and we failed again. And I just remember sitting on this like outdoor picnic bench, 90-degree heat, talking to Brad, just being like, dude, here's what happened, and going through a lot of specific details. And it's not that Brad is an expert on fire safety and building materials, but he had learned enough to know how to talk through the problem with me. And I think having that level of board engagement, as I'm sure you do with the boards that you're involved with, that is where you can really get a superpower in the collaboration with investors. And I think it's picking those folks that are going to be able to do that with you really, really wisely.
How did you decide to pick your investors? Because you had a very unique cap table. You had a mix of both traditional venture capital firms and then even real estate owners.
Yeah. It was highly strategic. No, I mean, it
definitely was highly strategic.
It was total happenstance until it became highly strategic, right? Like, I remember I was just texting with the Latch's first investor, a guy named Rustam Kawisji. I had met him when I was working at the Apple store. It was my summer job before I went and worked at Apple Corporate. And he came into the store. I met him because he was frankly a disgruntled customer. And we had a hilarious interaction where we did not have a good time. And about halfway through, I'm like, Rustam, I want to help you, but like, frankly, you're being kind of a jerk. Like, let's take a step back. I want to get you what you need, but like, you can't talk to me this way, because my manager had already told me, hey, this guy's a problem. We'll throw him out of the store if he gives you any trouble. And Rustam is hilarious. We've talked about this story many times. But I think that moment of meeting Rustam, that ended up being this, my first sort of entree into the real estate world. He's a very prominent architect. He worked at a very large real estate firm. And so when I had the initial idea for Latch, I called him and I said, hey, can we get lunch? So we sat down, and he's a potential hypothetical customer, and I said, hey, if this product existed in the world, Latch existed in the world, would you buy it for your buildings? And he said, I would absolutely buy it. I'm like, whoa, this is sick. And then he said something secondly, and he goes, and how much money do you need to start the company? And at that moment in time, I have just finished grad school, have never raised significant capital before, and I thought of the biggest number that I possibly could to say how much I needed to build a hardware, software business. What do you think my number was?
175K.
300,000.
Damn.
And Rustam said, cool, I'll give it to you, like, go start the company. And I think it was that first investor, being someone who was also a customer, gave me the confidence to say, okay, who else who understands this problem space could be a good investor? And so we worked with, the Camber Creek team, who now has raised a large PropTech fund in DC. We worked with Zach Aarons, who now has Metaprop, and all these folks were basically investing individually at this time before they had their own funds. But through those folks, we were able to meet Jenny at Techstars. We were able to meet Steven and Jonathan at the RGA and the RGA crew. And then it just started to snowball. We met, Brad and the primary team, Keith and the third prime team. And because we were in New York for the program, everybody knew somebody that was in real estate. And, one thing led to the next. And it was like, wait, did we just build the craziest cap table of New York real estate folks ever? And, there was literally a Wall Street Journal article written about the fact that so many of those competitive families got to know each other around investing in Latch.
I mean, you had what? Did you have the Rudins on there too?
We had the Rudins,
Milsteins?
the Milsteins. I can't remember who's public and not, but if there was a large New York real estate family, they're likely an investor or a customer or friendly. We had really did a good job of, and it wasn't just me, it was the whole team, of cultivating those relationships and bringing those people along for the journey.
It's this interesting market, and I think it happens in many other markets as well, where there's a keeping up with the Joneses.
Yeah.
And you did a great job of getting those folks on your cap table early, but I'm curious, once you had to get outside of those owners, what did you learn from selling into other real estate owners?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Dallas is not New York City. In good ways and in challenging ways. And I think it was, what is the simplest universal value proposition that is going to resonate across every stakeholder that we have? And I think the simplest universal value proposition was managing all of your tenants is a hassle. giving your tenants the flexibility and convenience that they want in the building and all the spaces and all the amenities that they want is a hassle. We can solve that problem for you. And you want to provide really cool experiences to your residents at your buildings. We're also a big component in that because we're something that people use generally multiple times every day. That's a cool, positive touch point. And I think that was really that dual of the operational efficiency around managing an entire fleet of users, devices, and then the like little surprise and delight moment of getting to use this cool product every day. You know, those were the two things that were universally relevant. In New York City, you could also say, okay, now you don't need to have as many full-time staff at the building to get deliveries. Really unique value proposition. In Dallas, you have oftentimes communities that have multiple towers that are all part of a larger community. And it's like, well, how do you do cross-building, multiple amenity zones? It's like, oh, well, we can handle that. But that's like not a problem you have in New York City. We don't have highly amenitized buildings in a lot of Manhattan. You have a non-doorman building where you're just trying to get your packages. The value proposition to that owner and that tenant is very different than, oh, you have a pool, a gym, a fitness center, all in different towers in this community you have access to, and you need one credential to move around. And I think, you know, realizing that with that same product set, you could solve different problems, and how to tailor those messages, I think, was how we were able to, you know, penetrate major national REITs, et cetera, et cetera.
So you did an amazing job scaling Latch. You guys had great SPAC initially. You got out there in the market. And when I look back on the journey and I think about some of the conversations we've had, you mentioned that, you know, one of the things you wish you did was keep teams smaller.
Yeah.
Are there any other mistakes that when you look back on the history of the company, you reflect and are like, you know, I wish I did this differently?
Oh, there's so many. I mean, I think there's so many opportunities there were a lot of different opportunities that we had in the sharing economy, in the smart home. And, you know, I think about, okay, our customers were asking for so many things. What are the areas where we could have been uniquely best, as opposed to just filling out a conceptual solution in a tick box? And I think that, you know, there's pros and cons to those different approaches. But, you know, I think that for us, where we did our best work always was staying focused on a really core product-driven thesis and saying, we're going to do this end-to-end, and we're going to solve the best way of elevator floor access control that we can muster with a smartphone, right? And I think like solving sometimes smaller problems, but doing it really, really well was something, you know, I think that our team did exceptionally well. And, you know, I think those are things that you go back and you think about.
And so as you think about starting another company,
yeah,
is there one thing that you're definitely like, okay, I'm going to do this differently this time around?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I think that the ability to hire people at a particular caliber, it is actually, people are a finite, like there are only so many people in the world. There's only so many excellent people who live in New York City, who want to work at a technology company, who want to do X, Y, and Z. And I think recognizing that there is not an endless quantity of people and that is a scarce resource is something that you think about, you know, or I will think about in a different way and say, okay, what is the largest, most awesome team that can be built? And what are the capabilities that team is able to take on, and letting the awesome team constrain the mission as opposed to the other way around. Because I think just looking at it and saying, we're going to build this crazy thing. Well, if there are not all of the resources required to do that, there may be the money, there may be the market appetite, but if you don't have the people to execute on it, then, you know, you end up in a position where you're not able to reach the success that you want to.
Does that mean when you think about starting this company and interviewing and recruiting candidates that your style and how you interview is going to be different?
It's a good question. I mean, I think my style and how I interview candidates will be more like 2014 and less like 2021. I think
what was the difference?
I think the difference is that it becomes a more institutional process when you have hundreds of employees and there's been a whole bunch of different steps that they've gone through and different teams that they've met with. And I think at the end of the day, actually going with your gut about whether or not this person is going to be able to do this thing and trusting your intuition more. And it's not to say you shouldn't have processes and you shouldn't, you know, account for that, but I think really being confident to say, no, this person can do this, even if the data says that they can't, or no, this person can't do this, even though the data says that they can. And I think just being more, continuing to be more intuitive about that is the right thing to do.
I want to switch back to personal for a minute.
Yeah.
Before we wrap. So there's a story that I think you told publicly about, I think it was the day that you guys were SPACing, or no, you found out that you were going to be going public.
Yeah.
And you went for a walk and you ended up crying on that walk. It reminds me a lot, honestly, about, I think the day I found out I was getting like the Forbes 30 under 30 thing.
Yeah.
And I remember I was crying in the shower because I was like, it doesn't feel the way that I thought it was going to feel. Why did you cry on your walk?
Yeah. So it was, I think, different than that. For me, it was like, it was this moment of realizing that I had achieved a level of personal safety that I didn't realize that I had been fighting for. And I think that in some ways I had been in fight or flight mode for 15 years. And that was a moment where I'm like, okay, this is an incredibly hard charging moment, and I'm not going to like take my foot off the gas. But at the same time, like, this new thing has broken free in your brain, and now you have to go back and process everything that you put in the rearview mirror in order to get to this moment. And for me, it was a lot of compartmentalization about the loss of my dad and a lot of things that surrounded that period of time. And that was the moment when I realized that I needed to unpack a lot of those things. So that's why, that moment just hit me.
And what came up for you after you were leaving Latch and, putting that chapter behind you?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely a sense of disappointment and loss about, the way that my tenure was ending in certain ways, but then also looking at it and saying, this was an incredible adventure and an incredible thing that we got to build with an incredible group of people, and being just immensely and deeply grateful for what had happened. And I don't know if I've shared this with you, but I watch The Office a lot. It's like, it's something that I almost watch every day to like fall asleep. And there was a quote from Dwight Schrute when he leaves Dunder Mifflin, and he says, "Nothing is on my horizon except everything. Everything is on my horizon." And I think there was a moment where I shifted from not woe is me, but like, oh man, this is like a huge part of me that isn't there anymore, and a huge community that I had built over a decade that was my friend group, my family group, my professional group. And it's like, wow, now that is not going to occupy the same place in my life, but the whole world is open in front of me, and I need to go out and build in that again. And I think that taking the time and space and getting really intentional about what I wanted to build, and not on the company side, on the personal side. I looked and said, okay, if I fast forward a decade from now, and I'm in my early 40s, what are the things that I'm going to regret? And for me, it was, if I don't have a family that I have built with someone amazing, I'm going to really regret that. I want to prioritize time into that in a way that I haven't before. And, I think that getting clear on what I wanted and what I wanted to prioritize was what has really made this season of life so beautiful and so valuable, and has enabled me to, build this next level of foundation for all the things that I'll build going forward.
How did you actually go through that process? Because I feel like a lot of founders, after they roll out of their companies or they sell their companies, they flounder for a long time, and they're like treading water. I mean, what did you do tactically to actually internalize what it is that you want now?
So I think, what I did was, I love to drive, and I knew that for somebody, I probably traveled the last couple years, I would guess 250 days a year. And so I knew that going from 250 days a year of travel to just like stopping was going to be super shocking. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to drive across the country. So I drove across the country. I took a long way and I got across the country. And then I'm like, I'm going to drive back. So then I drove back across the country. And then I'm like, all right, I did that. I should go drive did a big chunk of Europe. Then I did a large chunk of the Sahara Desert, not in like any particular, I think being able to wander without an agenda and just be alone with your thoughts. I did most of it by myself, just sitting in the car, listening to music, listening to audiobooks, but really just thinking. And then at night I would write. And at this point I was just reconnecting with my now wife. And we were not able to be in the same place a lot. And so for me, writing my stories and hearing her stories, she, after graduating, had adventures all over the world, working in Africa in the defense and national security space, and I thought I had cool stories and it's had a cool decade. And I was just like, oh, no, you're not cool at all. But reading her stories, sharing my stories, it really helped me get in touch with a lot of the things that I had put in that rear view mirror. And so being able to have that dedicated time to do that, and then to say, oh, I know these things about myself. I know these things about this other person. These are the fundamental values upon which I'm going to build the rest of my life. That was invaluable. And so I would say, if you're a founder that is leaving a particular stage of life, try to find something that keeps you busy, like physically, so that you are occupied, but leaves you mentally free. And for me, driving was a thing where it's like, I have a mission that I have to accomplish. You wake up and it's like, I got to hit 8 hours on the road, 12 hours on the road today. So you have a purpose, you have a mission, but then your mind gets to wander, because it turns out when you're driving across, the 7-8 hours of Utah desert or whatever it is, you don't need all of your cognitive power to look for stuff on the road. You have a lot of cycles to process things. And I think that that's what I would recommend to founders, is find something to keep you occupied on a day-to-day basis that isn't super mentally taxing, so you have the cycles to process everything else on a mental level.
It's so interesting. So after Ali, your former COO, left Latch, he also went on a drive.
Oh, I didn't know that.
He went on a long drive, and him and I had a call while he was on that drive. And he was telling me about his reflections and, what he was thinking about doing next. And that's when we ended up having the conversation about, if you want to start something new, we're working on something here at Primary. And look, he's now running a company here. And I think driving creates a lot of focus for you on the road. But then that creates a lot of, ability to think and dream and internalize. It's a different level of flow state.
It is. And I think that finding whatever your flow state might be, I do think driving is a pretty great one,
totally,
almost universally, but finding that flow state when you're in that time of transition, I think, is really important.
All right, last few questions here. You've said a lot in our conversations that if you're chasing money, do not start a company. You're going to fail. Why is this?
Because I think it goes back to that being problem motivated. If you're not intrinsically motivated by the problem, you are not going to have the stamina, the energy, the life force to make that happen, to build the solution and to see it the whole way through. And I think as we talk about seeing something the entire way through, you have to have the life force and the motivation to be sitting in a closet in China with very little sleep, thinking really intently about light leaks on the edge of an IML film in a factory in order to see the product the entire way through. And if you don't intrinsically care about creating whatever you're creating, you're not going to have the fortitude to go all the way through it.
What if financial security is the most important thing in your life?
Then I would say pick a business that is doing, creating financial security for other people, right? Literally. It's like, all right, how do most people build, financial security? It's through savings. It's through smart investments in real estate. It's through retirement accounts, right? Start a business in that space. Like, do something that you are primarily motivated by that problem, because that is what will give you the strength to keep going, keep going, keep going.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed 3 buckets of founders. You either need to make a ton of money, you absolutely need to solve a problem, or you have something to prove to the world, maybe yourself, other people, your children, etc.
Yeah.
And if you fall in all 3 buckets, it's probably the best combo, but you at least need to fall into one.
I totally think that's right.
And you gave a speech at Georgetown, and in that speech you said, each of our lives can be summarized as a sentence. If you had to summarize your life in a sentence, what do you want it to be?
Wow. So I have been always fascinated by Benjamin Franklin's life. And I think what he was able to do as an inventor, as an entrepreneur, as a diplomat is something that has always deeply inspired me. And I think about, you know, being someone who is able to build things and to build relationships with international governments you need to help protect yourself against a colonial power, be able to build consensus in a community to start the first fire department in America, to build consensus in an academic community to, you know, build some of the first universities in the United States, to discover, he did discover electricity, but to like do formative research around that, to do formative research around the jet stream, and to just say, hey, I'm going to just do stuff. I'm going to build stuff and worry about the labels later. I think that that is what makes Benjamin Franklin so amazing. And, you know, I'm no way putting myself in that sentence, but I think that if I look back on my life and I can say, I got to build things in business, I got to build things in engineering and science, and I got to build things in policy and get to embody that, you know, inventor diplomat spirit, that'll be something that I'll be enormously proud of.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. That's right.
The last question I ask everyone is, if you were the mayor of New York, what's one thing you would change?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't live in New York anymore, so I don't know. Do I still have a stake in this problem?
Of course.
I think
You're a diplomat.
I'm a diplomat. That's right. I guess, you know, I think about studying the problems up close. And I feel like I'm frankly not close enough to the problem on a day-to-day basis to say, okay, this is what I would change. So I'm gonna.
So you would say study the problems up close.
That is exactly what I would say. I was like, what is the day of an average New Yorker? What are the biggest pain points? And you know, how do you solve those biggest pain points? And so for me, I mean, I guess one thing, I have really stopped using the subway. Kind of post-pandemic. And I read that the subway is not safe and the subway is whatever. So I guess maybe my cop-out answer based on a little bit of lived experience and reading the paper of record here is that they should work on the subway system. But realistically, I would have to interrogate that problem a little closer.
I thought you were going to go with trash bins, but I'll take that answer.
That would be Tim Stoneley. Yeah, he's trash obsessed. We've talked about trash cans a lot, but I would not be the trash guy.
I love it. Well, thanks for joining me, man.
Thanks so much, Jason.
Appreciate it.